Hi folks, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And the project is for you and I to work through the entire Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. It doesn't matter whether you're here for the first time or you've been here for nearly getting on to 500 episodes now. You are most very welcome. You can approach our time together in one of two ways. You can just pick up and join us from today as we work through, or if you want, you can just go back right to the beginning and make the commitment to study the whole Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse, at whatever pace is comfortable for you. That, of course, is a choice for everybody. These studies are posted 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, but other than that, you are so welcome to be here. And please do hang along at the end where I'll give you some information about ways which you can connect and access other free Bible teaching resources that I make available. So with that all said, it's bye for now, and we'll pick up where we left off last time, halfway through Matthew chapter 16. Okay friends, as I said, picking up exactly where we left off last time, which is this conversation between Jesus and his disciples in the area of geographically located at Caesarea Philippi, talking initially to the disciples but now narrowing it down to just Peter, where he makes this, is it a commission, is it a promise? Well, let's read it together and see what it says. So remember, he's just asked the disciples, "Who do you think I am?" And Peter is the one who speaks up and says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And then Peter replies and answers him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will remain bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will remain loosed in heaven." Now, many would recognize this passage as one of the great passages of the New Testament. However, it is also one of the passages that has caused the most difficulty. It's historically been a very difficult passage for people to approach without prejudice. And that's probably because it's been used by the Roman Catholic Church as the foundation of their position of the Pope as being the head of the Church. This passage is taken by most in the Roman Catholic Church to mean that to Peter were given the keys which would admit or exclude any individual from heaven. And it also was given to him the power to absolve or not to absolve an individual of their sins. Now, it's further argued by some in the Roman Catholic Church that Peter held these tremendous rights and therefore became the first bishop of Rome, and that power has descended to all the bishops of Rome that have existed ever since and down to this day. So in other words, that authority lies with whoever is chosen as the Pope for the current generation. It doesn't take you to think about that for very long to see how impossible that doctrine is for anybody who's a non-Catholic believer. And it's also to see how Protestant and Catholic believers tend to approach this passage with a certain degree of entrenched ideas, and maybe one might say prejudice, rather than just approaching it with a blank slate and a genuine desire to be open to discover what is its true and main meaning. Well, first of all here, we have to say there is absolutely a play on words going on here. Peter the rock, he's described as. Now, in Greek, Peter is Petros, and the word rock is Petra. And even Peter's Aramaic name, which was Cephas, also was the word that was Aramaic for rock. So in either language, in whatever way you look at it, we have a play on words here. And this play on words is used immediately after he makes his great discovery where he declares who Jesus is, i.e. he has just said, "You are Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then Christ's immediate reply to that is, he says, "And you are Petrus, and on this Petra I will build my church." Whatever else this word means, it is certainly a word that was meant to be a great encouragement to Peter. The rabbis of that time also took this word and applied it to Abraham, and they said, "Look unto the rock from whence we are hewn. And as descendants of Abraham, Abraham was the rock upon which the nation and the purpose of God were founded and embodied in the nation of Israel. It's also worth noting that this word rock is used again and again in the Old Testament and applied to God himself. For example, he is the rock and his work is perfect, is heard in Deuteronomy 32:4, and there is no rock like our God, 1 Samuel 2:2. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, 2 Samuel 22:2. And then from Psalms, who is the rock except our God, Psalm 18:31. So one thing is very clear here: to call anyone a rock in those days was a great compliment, and no Jew who knew his Old Testament to any level could ever hear or use that phrase without his thoughts turning to God, who alone was the true rock of that person's salvation. So what then did Jesus mean when in this passage he uses the word rock and applies it to Peter? Well, to that question, I believe there are 4 answers that you can give, and they're not mutually exclusive. Augustine took the rock to mean Jesus himself. It's as if Jesus said, "You, Peter, and on myself, as the rock, as God, I will found my church. And the days will come when, as a reward for your faith, you will have great responsibility and authority in the church, but also you will be greatly remembered in the church's history." Now, a second explanation is that the rock simply stands for the truth, the fact that Jesus Christ himself is the Son of the living God. And we have just seen here to Peter that that great truth had just been divinely revealed to him and expressed by him. The fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God is, of course, the main foundation stone of the church's faith, and belief in that truth is undeniable and unquestionable if you wish to be part establishing anything that would declare that faith and truth. Now, a third explanation is that the rock in some way stands for Peter's faith himself, because on the faith of Peter, the first apostle to express the full deity of Christ, is the rock upon which the church is founded. So in the sense that his faith was the spark which was to kindle the faith of the worldwide church. It was his initial impetus which brought about the worldwide community of faith of those who have been called by faith to be followers of Christ. And the last interpretation is my most favoured, but let me just add again that it doesn't mean that it's mutually exclusive to the others. All of these can very well be seen as true. But my most favoured interpretation, the core, the main one, I believe, is that the rock is, of course, God itself, because that ties in with how that phrase would have been used and extrapolated out of the Old Testament by any Jewish person at that time. You see, Peter was the first person on earth to fully understand who Jesus was and his relationship to the Old Testament. He was the first to make that huge leap of faith and see in Jesus the Son of the living God, the Messiah in flesh, incarnated. In other words, Peter was the first member of the church, and in that sense the whole church is built upon him because others follow after him. And in the ages to come, everyone who makes the same discovery as Peter is, in a sense, is just another stone added to this pictorial edifice, this metaphor of the edifice of the Church of Christ on earth. Here Peter is the foundation, but in the sense that he is the one person, the first person upon this whole church, this whole community of faith, this whole group of people who will make the same declaration that he did and recognize Jesus in the same way that he did, and he was simply the first human being, the first man to discover who Jesus really was. In Ephesians 2 verse 20, Paul writes, the prophets and the apostles are said to be the foundation of the church, and it is on their work and their witness and on their devotion that the church on earth, humanly speaking, depends. And that doesn't contradict what's going on here. And in fact, in the same passage, Jesus Christ is said not only to be the rock, but he's said to be the chief cornerstone. In other words, he's the force, the person who holds the church together. Without him, the whole edifice would disintegrate and collapse. In 1 Peter, Peter himself writing, verses 4 to 8, he describes all Christians as living stones who, upon their faith, are built into the fabric of the church. It's very clear to see that the New Testament writers throughout the whole New Testament took the picture of the church community as a building, and they used it as a metaphor for the community of faith, for the body of believers. But they used it in many ways. But at the back of the idea was always the idea that Jesus was the real first foundation stone upon which the church was built, and he is the only power and the only one who actually, in that sense, holds the church together. And what Jesus is saying to Peter here is that on him he would found his church that was established through faith in him. He did not mean that the church depended on Peter in any way, but that it depended first on him himself, on God himself, the rock. But it did mean that the church would begin with Peter, in the sense that Peter is, in that sense, the foundation of the church. And that is a unique honour, a special honour and a special position that he holds. And no Catholic, or Protestant for that matter, can ever take that away from him. The second point to bear in mind here, which is very important, is the word used for church here is ecclesia. Now, very often when we see the word church in the New Testament, it can convey something of a wrong impression. We are very inclined to think today of churches as institutions, organisations, buildings even, things with offices, services, meetings going on. But the word that Jesus used here was ecclesia, or in Aramaic, gahal, which is the word the Old Testament used for the congregation of believers, the gathering of the people of the Lord. Wherever they came together, there was ecclesia. Therefore, what Jesus is saying to Peter here is, Peter, you are the beginning of this new community of people of the Lord, the new fellowship of those who believe in my name. And Peter is the first of this new fellowship of believers in Christ. So it's not about a church in an institutional sense, still less about any church in what we would today call a denominational sense. This is something, a community that began with Peter. Which began with Peter was a fellowship of all who declared belief and faith in Jesus Christ. And it was not a community that identified with any particular building or any single synagogue, and was not limited to any single place, but embraced everyone who declared they loved the Lord and accepted him as the Messiah, the Saviour of their sins. Therefore, what we can say about the first part of this controversial passage is that it means that Peter is the foundation stone of the church, in the sense that he is the first of the great fellowship of people who joyfully declare their own personal discovery that Jesus Christ is Lord. But in the ultimate sense, it is God himself who is the rock upon which this family of believers, which we today call the church, is established. But then it goes on to say this other extra added phrase, which again causes much consternation and controversy. He tells Peter that the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. Now, the idea of gates prevailing is not a natural or an easy metaphor for us to understand today. For many, it will call the image to mind of a fortress. And that suggestion does find support in the fact that the location where Jesus is teaching these things here is on the top of a mountain overlooking Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus was based. This is where he's having this conversation with the disciples, and at that place stood a great castle we already discovered, which would have been in its full glory at that time. And maybe again Jesus is simply using the location he's in to create an image of the church as being like a fortress, and the forces of evil being like an opposing army laying siege to a fortress, and saying that the power of that evil will never prevail against his church. Also, it's worth noting that in the ancient Middle East at that time, the gate was the place, especially in towns and villages, where the elders and the rulers of the community met, and they dispensed counsel, wise counsel, and justice. Anyone with a problem would be told to go to the city gate and speak to the elders. So the gates came to represent the place of local government. So then the phrase can also be seen to mean that the powers and principalities, the very government of hell, so to speak, will never prevail against his church. But there's another idea we can throw in the mix here. If we go back and connect it to the idea that this is the rock upon which the church is founded, and it is the conviction that Jesus is none other than the Son of the living God, then the one person to whom the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, could not contain was, of course, Jesus Christ. He rose again on the third day. He broke the bounds of death. As the writer of the Acts to the Apostles put it, it was not possible for him to be held by death. Thou wilt not abandon my soul to Hades, nor let the Holy One see corruption, Acts 2:27 tells us. This indeed may be a triumphant reference being used here by Jesus and said to Peter, and is nothing less than a declaration of his coming resurrection. Jesus may very well just be saying to him, you've discovered that I am the Son of the living God, but the time will come when I will be crucified, but yet the gates of hell will close behind me, but they will remain powerless to shut me in. Even the gates of hell have no power against me, over me, because I am the Son of the living God. But however we take it, whether one interpretation or both or all of them, in this phrase, Jesus triumphantly expresses the indestructibility of even death to rob him of who he is, and the indestructibility of his church that will follow on. So let's close by just thinking a minute about the place of Peter in the historic church. We've come, and there are two phrases at the end which describe certain privileges which are given to him and certain duties which are laid upon Peter. He said to Peter that he has given him the keys of the kingdom. And this is obviously a difficult phrase for those of us of a Protestant tradition to hold or to interpret. But we do well to begin with by establishing the things about this phrase, this expression, of which we can be sure. The phrase always signified about holding the keys, always signifies some sort of special power or authority or responsibility. In the New Testament, this phrase is regularly attached to Jesus. We are told it is in his hands and no one else's that the keys are held. In Revelation chapter 1 verse 18, it tells us that upon the return of Christ, the risen Christ will say, I am the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. So it appears to me that what Jesus is saying to Peter is that in the days to come, you are going to be my steward of the kingdom. And in the case of Peter, the whole idea is that of opening, not shutting the door of the kingdom. That would soon become absolutely true, because we will see shortly at Pentecost, Peter does indeed open the door to 3,000 souls in one sermon in Acts 2:41. And he is also will be seen to open the door to the Gentile world through the centurion Cornelius, because after his conversion, thereafter it is open to the whole Gentile world, we're told in Acts chapter 10. Acts 15 tells us how the Council of Jerusalem opened the door wide for the Gentiles, and how it was Peter's witness to that council that made that possible. Acts 15. You see, the promise that Peter would have the keys to the kingdom was the promise that Peter would follow on with the means by which the door to God would be open for thousands and thousands of people in the days that followed. In other words, through the preaching and the declaration of the gospel. But it is not only Peter who has the keys to the kingdom. Thereafter, every Christian that follows him has them as well. For it is for every one of us to open the door of the kingdom to other people, and so to enter also into that great promise of Christ first made to the first believer, Peter. Jesus further promised Peter that what he bound would remain bound, and what he loosened would remain loosened. Now, theologian Richard Glover, I think, is very helpful in this, because he takes this to mean that Peter would lay people's sin before them and bind them to their consequences. In other words, that they would have their sins presented, and they would have the opportunity to let them loose and be free of them, of their sins, by telling them of the love and the forgiveness of God in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's an amazing thought. And in my mind, that means that such a duty, as fell on Peter, falls on every Christian every preacher, every teacher, or evangelist, or just anyone who's a Christian, that responsibility falls upon us as even just a friend to draw people's attention to how they are bound up in sin and show them how they can be set free, be loosed from that sin. To this phrase, to loose and to bind, were very common Jewish phrases at that time. To bind simply meant to declare something forbidden. In other words, to lay it out as something that was wrong. To declare and illuminate the difference between right and wrong. And to loose was to declare it aloud, or to declare that someone is free of it. So what Jesus is saying here to Peter is, Peter, you're going to have the initial grave and heavy responsibility laid upon you, and you are going to be the one who will have to make the decisions that will affect the welfare of this newly birthed church. This duty, if you like, of binding and loosening meant that Peter would have to take decisions about the early church's life and the practice of the individuals in it, which would have very far-reaching consequences into how it was established into the future. And indeed, we read throughout the earlier chapters of Acts that what we see in Jerusalem is exactly what is going on and what Peter did at that time. When we study this passage closely, a passage which has caused so much argument and controversy over the years, we can see that what it's dealing with is not organizations, it's not dealing with institutional churches or religious hierarchies, but with the things of salvation. And Jesus saying to Peter, your name means rock, and your destiny is to be a rock, means that you're the first man to recognize me for who I am, what I am, and therefore you're going to be the first stone in the editorship and the organization and the outworking of that community of fellowship of those who will subsequently belong to me. You will have to stand up for that fellowship. You will have to stand up for it against the embattled powers of evil, but know that no one will prevail against it. And in the days to come, you will be the one who will unlock the doors of the kingdom, not just to Jews, but to Gentiles also. And also, Peter, your role, he's telling him, is to guide and help and solve the problems and direct the work of this infant and growing fellowship of believers, this thing we today call the worldwide church. You see, Peter was the first to make the discovery as to who Jesus really was, to fully make that discovery. And because of that, Peter was given both great privilege and great responsibility. But yet it is a discovery which everyone must make for themselves. And when they make it, the same privileges and responsibilities are now laid upon them, laid upon us, in fact. Let's just close off with the final verse here. He gave order to his disciples to tell no one that he was God's anointed one. So that's the closing chapter. So there's a final warning here. So although the disciples at this point had grasped the fact that Jesus was God's Messiah, they still had not fully grasped what that remaining truth actually meant for them. They had to have a great deal more discipleship training and teaching. To them, it initially meant something different from what it meant to Jesus. Now, Peter was the first to move beyond that, but the others would need to be discipled beyond that, because they were still thinking in terms of a conquering Messiah, a warrior king, someone who would come and sweep the Romans from Palestine and lead Israel to what I assume they imagined was some sort of political power. And that is why, at this point, Jesus commands them, for now, to remain silent. You see, if at this point they'd gone into the wider world and they'd preached their uninformed, not fully formed ideas so soon, then they probably would have just been responsible for raising another in a long line of tragic rebellions. They might have only produced another outbreak of violence from Rome, and the early church would have been doomed to disaster before it had even fully been birthed. Before they could preach that Jesus was the Messiah, they had to learn what that fully meant when it said he was the Messiah. And this is the point of fact that Jesus now will begin to open their eyes that the fact for him, the fact of his messiahship, could mean nothing other than the way of the cross. He will soon tell them that he must go to Jerusalem, and he will soon tell them that he will need to suffer at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. Now, it's interesting that three groups of men were the three groups of men who composed the Sanhedrin. The elders were the respected men of the people, the chief priests were predominantly the Sadducees, and the scribes were the Pharisees. So in effect, Jesus is saying, look, what you need to learn is that he is going to have to suffer for the sins of the world. He's going to suffer at the hands of the very leaders of the orthodox religious community out of which he had arisen. Wow, what a sobering thought that is for all of us who wish to walk the same path in life as Jesus Christ did. Okay friends, that's it for today. I do hope you found that very challenging passage helpful, and I gave you a few keys to interpreting it. Now, can I remind you that there is always a transcript on each and every one of these talks that I gave, and it's available in the episode notes of the podcast. And everything I do and every teaching I put out there is a resource that is freely available, copyright free, in the public domain for you to use and share in whatever way you want. You do know that by liking or sharing or sending a link to this on the social media places that you exist, you are bringing the study of the Bible into the orbit of more and more people's lives. And it is through that we believe that many lives are being and will be transformed. So consider doing that maybe. If you're enjoying it and benefiting from it, why not allow others to as well? Now, the podcast is hosted on thebibleproject.buzzsprout.com. Now, it doesn't matter where you're getting your podcasts from. I know people are all over the place. Deezer, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. There are hundreds of podcast platforms now. But I'm also aware that some of them don't put the active links in the listings in the podcast episode notes page. So if you're not seeing links through which you can connect to other aspects of my ministry, just visit the podcast, as I said, on thebibleproject.buzzsprout.com, and you'll find all the links are always active there. Places where you can join the Facebook community, see the long-term archive of teaching that I'm creating on YouTube, and also ways in which you can access more formal structured discipleship courses, places like Patreon, LinkedIn, and there's even a place where you can partner and financially support this ministry. But the main thing is that you're all here, that we're all gathering together in this community of thousands of people around the world who've made the commitment to have their lives transformed by the study of the Bible, the Word of God, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, over ever long it takes, or however long the Lord grants for us to do this. So with that said, thanks again, and I do hope I'll see you back here tomorrow. Well, it'll be tomorrow for me, it'll be whatever day it chooses to be for you, and whatever pace you're choosing to do this, through the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye bye for now.